I had a lot of doubts because of how much, she even told her, oh my gosh, your dad, he was great, he's my idol and blah, blah, blah. And I just felt like, wow.
For more than 4 decades, Priscilla Presley has carried a weight most of us cannot begin to imagine. She has been the keeper of a legacy so vast and so consuming that it has its own zip code, its own annual pilgrimage, its own mythology that grows wilder and more unmanageable with every passing year. She has stood at the gates of Graceland and smiled for cameras. She has given interviews about the man she married when she was barely more than a girl. She has raised their daughter in the shadow of a father who belonged more to the world than he ever belonged to them. And through all of it, through every rumor and every conspiracy and every bizarre claim that has circulated about Elvis Presley since the day he died, Priscilla has done something extraordinary. She has stayed quiet, not silent, but selective, not dismissive, but dignified. She has learned over the years which questions deserve answers and which ones feed something that can never be satisfied. She has watched people claim Elvis faked his death, that he's living in seclusion, that he's been spotted in gas stations and grocery stores from Michigan to Argentina. She has seen the theories multiply and mutate, each one stranger than the last, each one carrying with it a kind of desperate hope that refuses to accept what the official record has stated plainly since August of 1977. And she has let them pass. She has let the noise be noise. Because engaging with it, she understood, would only make it louder. But then, something shifted. In recent months, Priscilla Presley did something she has almost never done before. She addressed, directly and on the record, the single most persistent and most emotionally charged conspiracy theory in the entire Elvis canon, the Bob Joyce theory. And what she said didn't shut it down, it didn't laugh it off, it didn't do any of the things people expected. What she said instead was so carefully chosen, so loaded with subtext, and so completely unexpected that it has left both believers and skeptics sitting in a kind of stunned silence, trying to figure out what exactly just happened. This isn't a woman who speaks carelessly. Priscilla Presley has spent decades learning how to protect Elvis's image, how to manage his estate, how to navigate the impossible line between honoring the man she loved and feeding the machine that turned him into an industry. She knows what happens when you give the wrong answer to the wrong question at the wrong time. She knows that every word she says about Elvis will be dissected, analyzed, quoted out of context, and used to support whatever narrative someone has already decided to believe. And still, when the Bob Joyce question came up, she didn't dodge it. She didn't deflect. She answered. And her answer has sent shockwaves through a community of people who have spent years, in some cases decades, studying this question with a seriousness that would surprise anyone who hasn't been paying attention. Because here's what you need to understand before we go any further. The Bob Joyce theory is not fringe anymore. It hasn't been for years. Millions of people across the world have listened to side-by-side audio comparisons of Elvis Presley and Bob Joyce, a pastor at a small church in Arkansas who has never claimed to be anyone other than exactly who he says he is. And those millions of people have heard something they cannot unhear. A voice so eerily, so impossibly identical to Elvis that even trained musicians and audio professionals have struggled to identify differences. Not similarities. Differences. The kind of vocal match that doesn't happen by accident, that doesn't happen through imitation, and that has never been adequately explained by anyone with the credentials to explain it definitively. Bob Joyce himself has never encouraged the speculation. He has never marketed himself as Elvis. He has never sold tickets or merchandise or capitalized in any visible way on the resemblance that has made him one of the most talked about figures in the Elvis community. He simply preaches. He sings gospel music in the same tradition Elvis grew up in. And every Sunday, people drive from across the country to sit in his congregation and experience something they describe as overwhelming, inexplicable, and deeply spiritual. These are not tabloid readers looking for a thrill. These are lifelong Elvis fans, people who know his voice better than they know their own, people who have listened to every recording, every bootleg, every scrap of audio that exists, and they are telling you with absolute conviction that what they are hearing in that Arkansas church is not an impersonator. It is him. So when Priscilla Presley, the woman who slept beside him, who bore his child, who watched him unravel under the pressure of being Elvis Presley, was finally asked point blank what she thinks about Bob Joyce, the world held its breath. And what she said wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It wasn't a dismissal or a confirmation or anything that fit neatly into the categories people had prepared for. What she said was something far more unsettling. Something that suggests she has thought about this more than anyone realized. Something that makes you wonder, even if you've never believed a conspiracy theory in your life, whether the woman who knew Elvis best might know something the rest of us are still trying to figure out. Because here's what no one saw coming. Her answer wasn't about Bob Joyce at all. It was about Elvis. And what he wanted. And what he never got. And whether the man the world turned into a king ever had the chance to just be a man. And that changes everything. What Priscilla Presley said, when the question was finally put to her directly, was not what anyone had scripted in their minds. She didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't offer the kind of polite dismissal that public figures use when they want to move on from something beneath their dignity. Instead, she paused, and in that pause, you could feel the weight of 40 years sitting on her shoulders. 40 years of being asked to defend a dead man's reputation. 40 years of being the keeper of a story that the world refuses to let end. And then she spoke, and what came out was something so unexpectedly vulnerable, so layered with grief and understanding and a kind of weary compassion, that it stopped people cold. She said, and these words matter more than almost anything else in this entire conversation, that she understands why people want to believe Elvis is still alive. She said it without condescension, without judgment. She said it like a woman who has spent decades watching the world refuse to let go of a man she had to let go of a long time ago. She acknowledged that the love people have for Elvis, the need they feel to keep him present, to keep him real, to keep him somehow accessible even now, is not foolishness. It is not delusion. It is love. And love, she said, does not always follow logic. It follows need. And the need people have to believe that Elvis Presley did not die alone and broken and over-medicated in a bathroom at 42 years old is a need she recognizes because she has felt versions of it herself. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. But here's where it gets complicated. Here is where Priscilla's answer moves from empathy into something far more unsettling. Because she did not stop there. She did not simply say, I understand why you feel this way, but he's gone, and you need to accept that. She didn't close the door. She left it open. Not wide open, but open enough that the light coming through it has left people on both sides of this debate uncertain about what they just heard. She talked about Elvis's deep and abiding desire for privacy. She talked about how suffocated he felt by fame, how trapped he was inside a life that gave him everything except the one thing he wanted most, which was to be left alone. To be ordinary. To walk into a room without every person in it needing something from him. And then, in a moment that has been replayed and analyzed and quoted in every corner of the Elvis internet, she said something that felt almost like permission. She said that if Elvis had found a way to step out of the spotlight, to live quietly, to return to the music and the faith that mattered to him most without the circus that came with being Elvis Presley, she would not blame him. She would understand. She did not say he did it. But she did not say he didn't. And the space between those two things is where millions of people are now living, trying to figure out what she meant and what she didn't mean. And whether the woman who knew him best just told us, in the most careful language imaginable, that she has made peace with a possibility the rest of the world still calls impossible. What makes this so shocking is not just what Priscilla said. It is who she is. This is not a woman given to wild speculation. This is not someone who profits from keeping conspiracies alive. Priscilla Presley runs Graceland. She has spent her entire adult life managing Elvis's estate, protecting his image, and making sure that his legacy is treated with the respect and dignity it deserves. She has every reason in the world to shut down theories that suggest Elvis faked his death. Every financial reason, every reputational reason, every personal reason. And yet, when given the opportunity to do exactly that, she chose a different path. She chose nuance. She chose empathy. And she chose words that left room for doubt. That choice matters, because Priscilla did not have to say any of this. She could have dismissed the Bob Joyce theory with a single sentence and moved on. She could have said, "I was there when he died, I identified his body, this is offensive to his memory, and we will not dignify it with a response." That would have been the easy answer. The expected answer. The answer that protects Graceland and the estate and the carefully curated version of Elvis that millions of people pay to visit every single year. But she didn't say that. And the fact that she didn't say that is, for a lot of people, more telling than anything she did say. Because here's what Priscilla knows that the rest of us can only guess at. She knows what Elvis sounded like when he was alone. She knows what he talked about in the hours when the cameras were off and the handlers were gone and it was just the two of them in the quiet. She knows what he was afraid of. She knows what he dreamed about. And she knows, better than anyone alive, whether the man who died in 1977 was a man who had made peace with his life or a man who was still searching desperately for a way out. So when she speaks about the possibility, however remote, however unlikely, that Elvis might have wanted to disappear, she is not speaking theoretically. She is speaking from memory, from intimate knowledge, from a place of understanding that no historian, no biographer, no fan, no matter how devoted, will ever be able to access. And that is what makes her answer so unsettling. Because if Priscilla Presley, of all people, is willing to leave the door open even a crack, then maybe the people who have been standing outside that door for 40 years are not as crazy as the world has told them they are. There is a reason this theory has survived for decades, while 1,000 other Elvis conspiracy theories have flickered out and disappeared into the background noise of the internet. And the reason is not hope. It is not sentimentality. It is not the refusal of grieving fans to accept that their hero is gone. The reason this theory persists is evidence. Not proof, but evidence. The kind of evidence that sits in front of you and refuses to be easily dismissed no matter how much you want it to go away. And at the center of all of it, standing quietly in a small church in Arkansas with no security and no fanfare and no acknowledgement of the storm swirling around his name, is a man named Bob Joyce. Bob Joyce does not look like Elvis Presley. That is the first thing people notice when they see him for the first time. There is no jumpsuit, no sideburns, no theatrical presence. He is an older man now, graying, soft-spoken, dressed in the unremarkable clothes of a rural pastor who has spent his life serving a congregation that would fit comfortably inside a high school gymnasium. He does not move like Elvis. He does not carry himself like someone who was once the most famous man on the planet. And if you walked past him on the street, you would not give him a second glance. But then he opens his mouth, and the entire room changes. The voice is not similar to Elvis Presley. It is identical. Not in the way a talented impersonator can mimic the sound, but in the way that every single vocal signature, every vibrato, every tonal quality, every subtle inflection that made Elvis's voice unmistakable is present in Bob Joyce's voice without any apparent effort. Audio engineers have run spectral analysis comparing isolated vocal tracks from Elvis recordings to recordings of Bob Joyce preaching and singing in his church. And what they have found is not resemblance. It is overlap. The kind of overlap that does not happen between two different human beings. The kind of overlap that suggests, at a level deeper than subjective opinion, that these voices are coming from the same instrument. Now, the immediate counter-argument is that Bob Joyce must be an impersonator, that he has spent years studying Elvis's voice and has trained himself to replicate it so precisely that even technology cannot tell the difference. But that explanation falls apart the moment you spend any time actually watching Bob Joyce. Because he is not performing. There is no affect, no attempt to sound like anyone other than himself. He preaches with the plain, unadorned sincerity of a man who has been doing this work for 40 years and has never needed an audience beyond the people sitting in the pews in front of him. He is not trying to sound like Elvis. He just does. Effortlessly, consistently, every single Sunday. And he has never once, in all the years this theory has followed him, capitalized on it. That detail is crucial. Bob Joyce has never sold autographs. He has never charged admission to his church. He has never appeared on television to promote himself or released an album marketed to Elvis fans or done anything that would suggest he is aware of or interested in the financial windfall that being Elvis Presley, even in secret, would provide. He has lived a modest, faithful, utterly unremarkable life. And the only people who know his name are the ones who have gone looking for him. He did not come looking for them. He has never encouraged the speculation, and when asked directly about the theory, he has responded with the same quiet consistency. He is not Elvis. He is a man called to preach the gospel, and that is all he has ever wanted to be. And yet, the people who sit in his church, many of whom have traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles to be there, will tell you without hesitation that something happens in that room that they cannot explain. These are not casual fans. These are people who have spent their entire lives listening to Elvis Presley. People who know his voice the way you know the voice of someone you love. People who can tell the difference between a 1956 recording and a 1968 recording by the texture of his tone alone. And they are telling you that when Bob Joyce sings, they are not hearing an imitation. They are hearing him. The same spirit, the same soul, the same unmistakable presence that made Elvis Presley who he was. This is where Priscilla's words take on a new and deeper significance. Because if you accept, even hypothetically, that Elvis wanted out, that he was drowning under the weight of being Elvis Presley, and that the only escape he could imagine was disappearing entirely, then Bob Joyce's life makes perfect sense. It is not the life of someone pretending to be Elvis. It is the life of someone who used to be Elvis and chose something quieter, something humbler, something that allowed him to return to the one thing that ever made him feel whole, which was singing for God in a room full of people who did not need him to be anything other than faithful. The timeline supports it. Bob Joyce's documented presence in Arkansas begins almost exactly when Elvis Presley's documented life ends. The geography supports it. Arkansas is close enough to Memphis to feel familiar, but far enough to disappear. The psychology supports it. A man suffocated by fame returning to the only tradition that ever made him feel free. And now, after decades of silence, Priscilla Presley has said, in her own carefully chosen words, that she would understand if he had done exactly that. Not that he did, but that she would understand. And for the people who have believed this for years, who have been mocked and dismissed and told they are living in fantasy, that acknowledgement from the one person who knew him best feels like vindication, not proof, but permission to keep believing that maybe, just maybe, the king never really left the building. He just found a smaller one. And maybe that is the part of this story that people are really afraid to say out loud. Maybe the reason Priscilla's response hit so hard is not because it proved anything. It didn't. It was not a confession. It was not a coded message. It was not the final missing piece that suddenly makes every mystery collapse into certainty. But it did something almost more powerful than proof. It reminded people that behind every theory, behind every grainy comparison video, behind every whispered claim about Bob Joyce and Arkansas and the voice that refuses to sound like anyone but Elvis, there is a wound that never fully healed. Because Elvis Presley did not just die in 1977. Something larger happened. A generation lost the man they believed belonged to them. His family lost someone they could never grieve privately. And the world lost a figure so enormous, so emotionally loaded, that ordinary death felt too small to contain him. That is why the questions began almost immediately. Not because people were foolish, not because they wanted to disrespect his memory, but because the official ending never felt big enough for the life that came before it. The king of rock and roll, gone at 42, found alone, broken by pressure, medication, isolation, and the machinery of fame. For people who loved him, that ending felt unbearable. So they began to imagine another one. And that is where Priscilla becomes so important. Because she stands in a place none of the rest of us can stand. She is not simply a witness to Elvis's life. She is one of the last living bridges between Elvis Presley the myth and Elvis Presley the man. She knew him before the image fully hardened around him. She knew the private voice, the private fear, the private exhaustion. She saw the cost of the crown when the cameras were not rolling. And for decades, she has had to listen while strangers debated whether the man she loved really died, really escaped, really transformed himself into someone else. Imagine the cruelty of that. Imagine being asked over and over again to either defend the death of someone you lost or leave space for a fantasy that keeps him alive for everyone except you. That is why her answer matters so much. Not because it gives the internet permission to declare victory, but because it reveals the emotional truth underneath the question. Priscilla understands something that many skeptics refuse to acknowledge. The Bob Joyce theory is not only about Bob Joyce, it is about Elvis wanting peace. It is about Elvis escaping the cage. It is about the possibility that the man who gave his entire life to the public might have found one final way to take something back for himself. That is the fantasy at the center of it. And it is a powerful one, because in some painful way, it feels like justice. But justice and truth are not always the same thing. That is the difficult line this story forces us to walk. Wanting Elvis to have survived does not mean he did. Hearing a voice that shakes you to your core does not automatically overturn death certificates, family testimony, medical records, and decades of documented history. And yet, dismissing everyone who hears that voice as delusional also misses something essential. People are not only reacting to sound, they are reacting to longing. They are reacting to the feeling that Elvis Presley, in the deepest part of himself, was never meant to be trapped inside the role the world built for him. That is what makes the Bob Joyce theory different from so many other celebrity conspiracies. It does not imagine Elvis hiding on an island, laughing at the world, surrounded by wealth and secrecy. It imagines him in a church. It imagines him singing gospel. It imagines him choosing humility over spectacle, worship over applause, a congregation over an audience. And whether that is true or not, it tells us something profound about what people believe Elvis really wanted. Not more fame, not more screaming crowds, not more gold records. Peace, redemption, a quiet room. A song that did not have to sell anything. And maybe Priscilla knows that better than anyone. Maybe that is why she did not treat the question like a joke. Because even if Elvis did not become Bob Joyce, the emotional shape of the theory touches something real about him. He did want escape. He did love gospel music. He did crave spiritual comfort. He did struggle under the impossible pressure of being turned into a living monument. And in that sense, the theory survives because it is built around a truth, even if the conclusion remains unproven. It gives Elvis the ending many people wish he had been allowed to have. Still, we cannot forget what this has cost the people who were actually left behind. For fans, mystery can feel romantic. For family, it can feel like a second grief that never ends. Every new theory forces Priscilla and everyone connected to Elvis back into the same impossible position. They must either correct the world again or stay silent and watch silence become evidence. That is a heavy burden. And it is one Priscilla has carried with more dignity than most people would have managed. She has protected the legacy, preserved the home, defended the man, and survived the myth. So what are we supposed to do with her response? Maybe we stop trying to make it smaller than it is? Maybe we stop demanding that it be either a confirmation or a denial? Maybe the real shock is that Priscilla Presley, after all these years, seemed to understand the believers without fully joining them. She seemed to acknowledge the ache behind the question. She seemed to recognize that people are not just asking whether Elvis is alive, they are asking whether he ever found peace. And that is the question that lingers. Not in a courtroom way. Not in a scientific way. In a human way. Did Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who sang gospel like prayer, ever get free from the machinery that devoured him? Did he leave this world trapped inside the legend? Or did some part of him escape into the music, into the faith, into the voices that still carry him forward? Maybe that is why this story refuses to die. Because Elvis himself became something bigger than evidence. He became grief. He became hope. He became the sound of a world refusing to say goodbye. And maybe Priscilla's answer was never meant to close the case. Maybe it was meant to remind us that some questions are more sacred than their answers. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. There are truths about Elvis Presley, Priscilla, and the people who love them that most fans will never hear. Subscribe, and it is one Priscilla has carried with more dignity than most people would have managed. She has protected the legacy, preserved the home, defended the man, and survived the myth. So what are we supposed to do with her response? Maybe we stop trying to make it smaller than it is? Maybe we stop demanding that it be either a confirmation or a denial? Maybe the real shock is that Priscilla Presley, after all these years, seemed to understand the believers without fully joining them. She seemed to acknowledge the ache behind the question. She seemed to recognize that people are not just asking whether Elvis is alive, they are asking whether he ever found peace. And that is the question that lingers. Not in a courtroom way. Not in a scientific way. In a human way. Did Elvis Presley, the boy from Tupelo who sang gospel like prayer, ever get free from the machinery that devoured him? Did he leave this world trapped inside the legend? Or did some part of him escape into the music, into the faith, into the voices that still carry him forward? Maybe that is why this story refuses to die. Because Elvis himself became something bigger than evidence. He became grief. He became hope. He became the sound of a world refusing to say goodbye. And maybe Priscilla's answer was never meant to close the case. Maybe it was meant to remind us that some questions are more sacred than their answers. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. There are truths about Elvis Presley, Priscilla, and the people who love them that most fans will never hear. Subscribe now, hit the bell, and share this video with someone who still believes in the King.
I know that I'm not worthy, Lord.
She didn't want to talk about it. For years, she didn't want to talk about any of it. Every time someone sent her a link, every time a former student forwarded her one of those videos with a breathless message attached, "Have you seen this?" Could it be him? She closed the tab, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and went back to her life. She was in her 80s. She had earned the right to be left alone with her memories. And her memories of Elvis Presley were exactly that. Hers, private and sacred, and completely untouched by the circus the internet had made of his legacy. But then, one evening in the winter, her granddaughter sat beside her on the couch and pressed play on a video she hadn't asked to see. And in the first 8 seconds of that recording, before she could reach over and ask her to turn it off, she heard the voice. And she went completely still. She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She just sat there with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes somewhere far away from that living room, and she didn't say a single word for almost 2 full minutes. Her granddaughter watched her face with the kind of careful worry you reserve for someone who has just received news that hasn't fully landed yet. When she finally spoke, all she said was, "Play it again." And her granddaughter did. And then she asked her to play it one more time after that. What she was hearing was Bob Joyce, a pastor from Benton, Arkansas, a man she had never met and never heard of before that evening, singing "How Great Thou Art" to a small congregation gathered in a modest church far from anywhere famous. The recording was not professional. The acoustics were rough and the camera work was shaky, and the whole thing had the slightly washed-out look of footage shot on a phone by someone sitting 3 rows back. None of that mattered, because the voice coming through those tiny speakers did something to her that she had not felt in nearly half a century. It reached across the room and grabbed her somewhere deep and old, somewhere she thought had long since gone quiet. She had been Elvis Presley's piano teacher. She had sat beside him on a wooden bench when he was still a teenager, still a boy from Tupelo, with grease in his hair and fire in his chest, and absolutely no idea what was coming for him. She had heard his voice before the world had touched it, before the microphones and the stadiums and the managers and the mythology had shaped it into the thing everyone else would spend the rest of their lives mourning. She had heard him sing in the plainest and most unguarded way that a human being can sing quietly, imperfectly, for no one but himself and God and the woman sitting next to him at the keys. She knew that voice the way you know the sound of your own name spoken in the dark. She knew every corner of it. And now, sitting on her couch in her 80s, she was hearing something that reached into those corners and fit. She did not believe that Bob Joyce was Elvis. Let that be said plainly and immediately, because she would want it said that way. She is not a woman who trades in fairy tales, and she is not someone who would insult the memory of a man she genuinely loved by folding him into an internet conspiracy. But that was precisely what terrified her about that video. The similarity wasn't the wild, wishful kind that fans manufacture out of longing. It was specific. It was technical. It was the kind of likeness that demands an explanation, not a dismissal. And the more she watched, because she did keep watching, long after her granddaughter had gone to bed, the more she felt the first slow stirrings of something she hadn't expected to feel. Not wonder, not hope, anger. Because what she was watching wasn't just a man who happened to sing with a familiar warmth. What she was watching was a phenomenon that had grown so enormous, so deliberately fed, so ruthlessly packaged by people who had no personal memory of Elvis and no loyalty to his truth, that it had taken on a life of its own entirely. Millions of people had seen these videos, Millions of people were sitting with the same shiver she had felt, and instead of someone trustworthy helping them understand what that shiver actually meant, they were being handed a ghost story and told to click subscribe. That was when she made the decision. Not to confirm the theory, not to condemn the pastor who she was increasingly convinced was simply a good man trapped inside someone else's obsession, but to do what no one else in this entire conversation was actually qualified to do. To tell the truth about the voice. The real voice. The one she knew before the rest of the world ever got their hands on it. Because she had sat beside Elvis Presley. She had heard him when he was young and frightened and brilliant and completely himself. And what she was about to share about what that voice really was, where it truly came from, and why the comparison to Bob Joyce was both more understandable and far more complicated than anyone online had bothered to explain, would make you question everything you thought you already knew. People talk about Elvis's voice the way they talk about lightning, like it was something that arrived fully formed from somewhere outside of nature, something that couldn't be taught or traced or explained by ordinary means. And she understood why. She had watched audiences react to him. She had seen what happened to a room the moment he opened his mouth on a stage. But she also knew something those audiences never did. Something that the mythology of Elvis Presley has spent 50 years quietly burying beneath the legend. That voice had a beginning. It had a source. And it was far more human, far more rooted, and far more traceable than the world has ever been willing to admit. When she first met Elvis, he was not yet the king of anything. He was a skinny, restless boy who showed up for piano lessons with more enthusiasm than discipline and a habit of turning every hymn she assigned him into something that made the bench vibrate. He was not easy to teach in the conventional sense, because convention bored him almost instantly. But when she asked him to sing alongside the keys, something shifted in the room. He didn't perform when he sang in that small space. He didn't reach for anything or push toward any effect. He simply opened up, and whatever was living inside him came out without asking permission. That was the voice she knew. Raw, unpolished, and devastatingly honest in a way that his recorded work, as extraordinary as it was, could only ever partially capture. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. What she noticed immediately was where that sound came from in his body. Elvis sang from a place that most trained vocalists are specifically taught to avoid, deep in the chest, heavy with resonance, with a natural vibrato that wasn't a technique so much as a tremor, the kind that comes from genuine feeling rather than muscle memory. His phrasing was unhurried in a way that felt almost reckless, like a man who trusted the song completely and had no anxiety about where it was going. And when he sang gospel, which he returned to constantly, obsessively, the way a man returns to water there was a quality in his voice that she could only describe as reverence worn on the outside. He didn't contain it. It spilled. She spent years assuming that what Elvis had was singular, unrepeatable, and then the internet handed her Bob Joyce. The first thing she did after that night on the couch was go back and listen more carefully. Not emotionally, but technically, the way she had been trained to listen across decades of teaching music. She stripped away her feelings about Elvis and tried to hear Bob Joyce as simply a voice. And what she found was not a mystery. It was, in fact, a very specific and traceable thing. The chest resonance was nearly identical. The unhurried phrasing was there. The vibrato had the same involuntary quality, the sense of emotion pushing through rather than being applied on top. Even the way both men handled the final note of a phrase, letting it fall rather than landing it cleanly, was a match that made her sit forward in her chair. But here is what none of the viral videos ever stopped long enough to tell you, and it is the single most important thing she wants the world to understand. Those qualities did not originate with Elvis Presley. Elvis learned to sing in church. He learned on hard wooden pews in Pentecostal congregations in Mississippi and Tennessee, surrounded by men and women who worshiped with their entire bodies and treated music not as performance, but as prayer made audible. The chest resonance, the trembling vibrato, the unhurried surrender to the melody, these were not inventions of one extraordinary boy. They were the living, breathing inheritance of an entire tradition, passed down through generations of Southern gospel singers who never made a record and never stood beneath a spotlight, but who carried that sound in their bones the way other people carry the color of their eyes. Bob Joyce grew up inside that same tradition. He was shaped by the same churches, the same hymns, the same understanding that gospel music is not something you perform it is something that performs you. And when two men are formed by the same source, when they drink from the same deep well of sacred music in the same region of the country, across roughly the same era of American life, they do not merely sound similar. They sound like brothers, not because one became the other, but because they were both made by something older and larger than either of them. This is what she could not stop thinking about during all those nights she spent watching those videos and reading those comments. Not one person in that entire conversation was asking the right question. Everyone was so transfixed by the similarity that no one had paused long enough to ask what the similarity actually meant. They assumed that if two voices matched this closely, one of them had to be borrowed. But she knew, from a lifetime of sitting beside singers and listening to where music actually lives in the human body, that the truth was both simpler and more profound than that. Neither man borrowed anything. Both men were given the same gift by the same source. The difference is that one of them became Elvis Presley, and the world never recovered from losing him. And that, she said quietly, leaning back in her chair with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from carrying a truth too long, is exactly why people are so desperate to believe he never left. She didn't set out to visit Benton, Arkansas. It wasn't something she had planned or even seriously considered. But after weeks of watching those videos, after nights spent listening and thinking and feeling that low, persistent anger building somewhere behind her sternum, she decided she needed to see it with her own eyes. Not the videos. Not the comment sections full of weeping and wondering. The actual room. The actual man. She needed to understand what was happening to Bob Joyce in person, because something about what she was witnessing from a distance felt deeply wrong in a way she hadn't yet found the words to describe. She drove down on a Sunday morning in early spring, arriving before the service began, slipping into a pew near the back like any other visitor. And what she found when she looked around that small, ordinary church was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for something fringe, something that carried the faint electric charge of a gathering built around obsession. What she found instead was something that broke her heart quietly and completely. The congregation was full of elderly women clutching handbags in their laps. There were men in their 70s with hearing aids and worn dress shoes, couples who had clearly driven a very long way and were sitting with a particular stillness that you only see in people who have come somewhere carrying something heavy. There were younger people too, phones already raised before the service had even started, but they were not the majority. The majority were grieving, openly, unashamedly, and without any apparent awareness that grief was what had brought them there. When Bob Joyce walked in, she watched him the way she had trained herself to watch performers, not for the voice, not yet, but for the body, for what a person carries before the music starts. And what she saw was a man who looked tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had long ago made peace with a situation he never asked for and could not escape. He greeted people warmly. He smiled with genuine kindness. But there was something behind his eyes that she recognized immediately, because she had seen it before in another man entirely. It was the look of someone who understood that the room they were standing in had become, at least in part, about something other than what they intended it to be. He sang, and she let herself feel it this time, fully and without the clinical distance she had tried to maintain in front of her television. And it was extraordinary. Not because it proved anything. Not because it answered any of the questions the internet had spent years shouting into the void. It was extraordinary simply because it was real and earnest and offered without a single gesture toward spectacle. Bob Joyce was not performing Elvis Presley. He was worshiping God. And the tragedy, the thing that sat in her chest like a stone for the entire drive home, was that almost no one in that room was fully able to receive it for what it actually was. She spoke to several people outside afterward, standing in the pale spring sunlight while the parking lot slowly emptied. She asked them gently what had brought them here, and she listened without interrupting, which is something she had always been good at. And not one of them was crazy. That was what she needed people to understand more than anything else. These were not delusional people. These were not fringe conspiracists with tinfoil logic and wild eyes. These were ordinary, tender human beings who had loved Elvis Presley during the years when his music was the soundtrack to the most vivid moments of their lives, and who had never fully found a way to put that love somewhere safe after August of 1977. One woman, small and white-haired and impeccably dressed, took her hand without being asked and said something she had been turning over ever since. She said, very simply and without any embarrassment at all, that she just needed to believe he was still out there somewhere. That she couldn't make herself accept that a voice like that could just stop existing. That it felt like a violation of some natural law she had always trusted. And she was not asking to be corrected. She was not presenting a theory or demanding agreement. She was just telling the truth about what she felt, the way people tell the truth when they think no one important is listening. That was the moment the anger she had been carrying shifted into something more complicated, because she understood it. She understood it in her body, not just her mind, the way you understand something that lives too close to your own grief to be kept at arm's length. She had loved Elvis too. Not the icon, not the jumpsuit or the mythology or the tabloid ghost. The boy on the piano bench, the young man who sang like he was afraid and on fire at the same time. And she had lost him. And the loss had never entirely healed, because that kind of loss doesn't. But here is what she also knew, and what she needed to say plainly even though it was the harder thing to say. Elvis himself had asked her once, during one of their last conversations before the fame swallowed everything between them, to promise him something. He had looked at her with that particular directness he used when he meant something completely, and said that when he was gone, he didn't want to become a story people told to avoid the sadness. He wanted to be remembered, yes, but he wanted to be let go too. He said, with that quiet and devastating simplicity he sometimes surprised her with, that he had spent his whole life being what other people needed him to be. He didn't want to keep doing it after he was dead. And yet here we are. Here is the grief industry, vast and faceless and completely indifferent to what the king himself asked for, packaging his absence as content, monetizing the inability to let go, and using a good and blameless man in Arkansas as the vessel for all of it, without his consent, without his blessing, and without a single moment of genuine care for what it costs him to live inside someone else's resurrection story every single Sunday morning of his life. There is a last memory she has of Elvis that she has never shared publicly. Not because it is scandalous or dramatic or the kind of thing that would set the internet on fire, but because it is the opposite of all those things. It is quiet and small and entirely human, And those are precisely the kinds of memories that get swallowed whole by mythology if you aren't careful about protecting them. She has been careful for nearly 50 years, but she is sharing it now because she believes it is the only way to say what she actually came here to say, and to say it in a way that might actually land somewhere real inside the people listening. It was not long before the end. He was heavier than she had ever seen him, and he knew that she could see it, and the awareness of that sat between them in the room like a third person neither of them acknowledged directly. He had always been proud in the quiet way that sensitive people are proud not loudly, not aggressively, but with a deep and personal investment in how the people who truly knew him saw him. And sitting across from her that day, he looked like a man who had been slowly buried under the weight of something he had never asked to carry and could no longer find his way out from under. The fame. The expectation. The version of himself that the world had decided was the only version worth keeping. They talked for a long time about nothing particularly important, the way old friends do when the important things feel too large to approach directly. And then, near the end of the visit, almost as an afterthought, he said something that she wrote down that same evening because she knew instinctively that she would need it later. He said that the hardest part of being Elvis Presley was that no one ever let Elvis Presley just be a man. He said that from the moment it started, he had belonged to everyone else, and that somewhere along the way he had lost track of where the performance ended and the person began. And then he said, with a tiredness that went all the way to the bone, that he hoped when it was over, people would just let him rest, that they would take the music and hold it close, because the music was real, and the music was his, and the music was the truest thing he ever gave the world, but that they would let the man underneath it finally, mercifully, be still. She drove home from that visit, and she cried for a long time. Not because she knew what was coming, though some part of her did, but because she already understood that what he was asking for was the one thing she could not promise him. Because the world does not let its icons rest. It never has. It turns them into monuments and then into myths, and eventually into something so large and so abstract that the original human being disappears entirely inside the story the world needed them to become. And that is what Bob Joyce has been made into. Against his will, without his participation, and at genuine cost to his dignity and his peace. A monument to grief. A living, breathing permission slip for millions of people to avoid the finality of a loss that happened almost 50 years ago. She is not angry at those people. She said that plainly, and she meant it plainly. The grief is real. The love that produced it is real. The ache of losing a voice that felt like it belonged to the soundtrack of your own life is one of the most legitimate forms of mourning she has ever witnessed. But love that refuses to let go is not always the purest form of love. Sometimes it is the most selfish. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone you have lost is to stop needing them to still be here. Bob Joyce deserves better than what he has been made into. He is a man who found his voice in the same sacred tradition that shaped Elvis, who has spent his life offering that voice as an act of faith rather than performance, and who has watched helplessly as that quiet devotion was picked up by strangers and turned into a conspiracy that follows him everywhere he goes and will almost certainly outlive him. He never claimed to be Elvis. He never fed the theory. He never walked out in front of that congregation and winked at the camera. He just sang. And the world took that singing and built a cage around it and then locked him inside and called it a tribute. What we owe the dead is honesty. Not the honesty of cold facts recited without feeling, but the deeper honesty of refusing to let our need for comfort distort the truth of who they were and what they actually gave us. Elvis Presley gave everything. He gave his voice and his youth and his health and ultimately his life to a world that consumed him without ever once asking whether the consumption was sustainable. The least we can do, the very least, is honor what he specifically and personally asked for. To take the music, to hold it gently, and to let the man who made it be still. The fame, the expectation, the version of himself that the world had decided was the only version worth keeping. They talked for a long time about nothing particularly important, the way old friends do when the important things feel too large to approach directly. And then, near the end of the visit, almost as an afterthought, he said something that she wrote down that same evening because she knew instinctively that she would need it later. He said that the hardest part of being Elvis Presley was that no one ever let Elvis Presley just be a man. He said that from the moment it started, he had belonged to everyone else, and that somewhere along the way he had lost track of where the performance ended and the person began. And then he said, with a tiredness that went all the way to the bone, that he hoped when it was over, people would just let him rest, that they would take the music and hold it close, because the music was real, and the music was his, and the music was the truest thing he ever gave the world, but that they would let the man underneath it finally, mercifully, be still. She drove home from that visit and she cried for a long time, not because she knew what was coming, though some part of her did, but because she already understood that what he was asking for was the one thing she could not promise him, because the world does not let its icons rest. It never has. It turns them into monuments and then into myths, and eventually into something so large and so abstract that the original human being disappears entirely inside the story the world needed them to become. And that is what Bob Joyce has been made into. Against his will, without his participation, and at genuine cost to his dignity and his peace. A monument to grief. A living, breathing permission slip for millions of people to avoid the finality of a loss that happened almost 50 years ago. She is not angry at those people. She said that plainly, and she meant it plainly. The grief is real. The love that produced it is real. The ache of losing a voice that felt like it belonged to the soundtrack of your own life is one of the most legitimate forms of mourning she has ever witnessed. But love that refuses to let go is not always the purest form of love. Sometimes it is the most selfish. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone you have lost is to stop needing them to still be here. Bob Joyce deserves better than what he has been made into. He is a man who found his voice in the same sacred tradition that shaped Elvis, who has spent his life offering that voice as an act of faith rather than performance, and who has watched helplessly as that quiet devotion was picked up by strangers and turned into a conspiracy that follows him everywhere he goes and will almost certainly outlive him. He never claimed to be Elvis. He never fed the theory. He never walked out in front of that congregation and winked at the camera. He just sang. And the world took that singing and built a cage around it and then locked him inside and called it a tribute. What we owe the dead is honesty. Not the honesty of cold facts recited without feeling, but the deeper honesty of refusing to let our need for comfort distort the truth of who they were and what they actually gave us. Elvis Presley gave everything. He gave his voice and his youth and his health and ultimately his life to a world that consumed him without ever once asking whether the consumption was sustainable. The least we can do, the very least, is honor what he specifically and personally asked for. To take the music, to hold it gently, and to let the man who made it be still. She sat quietly for a moment after she said that, and then she walked to the old upright piano in the corner of her living room, the same one she had played for decades. And she sat down and placed her hands on the keys, and she played the opening notes of Unchained Melody, slowly and without accompaniment, the way Elvis had once asked her to play it during one of their last afternoons together. Not for an audience, not for a recording, just because the music was real, and because sometimes real is the only thing left worth offering. That is the Elvis she chooses to remember. not the ghost in the viral videos, not the conspiracy folded inside a small Arkansas church. The man on the bench beside her, young and frightened and blazing, with something the world had not yet learned to contain. And she is asking you, as plainly and as sincerely as she knows how, to choose to remember him the same way. If this story moves something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe so you never miss the untold truths behind the legend of the king. Share this with someone who still loves Elvis. And tell me in the comments, what is your most sacred memory of his voice? I read every single one.
This church is not running some kind of scam or scheme to make money, to get a following, to make people believe that I'm somebody that I'm not.
All the studio lights were blindingly bright. Not the kind of bright that feels welcoming, the kind that exposes everything. Bob Joyce sat in that chair, composed, rehearsed, ready. He'd done interviews before. Dozens of them. He knew how to sit, how to smile, how to tell his story in a way that made believers out of skeptics, or at least made them curious enough to listen. But something felt different about this one. The host's energy had shifted somewhere in the middle of the segment. Not hostile exactly, but probing. Deliberate. Like a hunter who'd picked up a scent. For years, Bob Joyce had been building a narrative that seemed almost too wild to be true, yet somehow impossible to completely dismiss. The theory, the claims, the photographs he'd studied frame by frame, the birthmarks, the mannerisms, the voice patterns he swore matched up in ways too specific to be coincidence. He'd developed a following, genuine people who believed him, who saw what he saw, who felt the gravitational pull of a story so extraordinary that it demanded to be true. And then there were the others, the ones who dismissed him outright. The skeptics who saw a man chasing shadows, a fantasist wrapped in the desperate hope that he'd stumbled onto the biggest secret in modern history. Bob Joyce had learned to live in that liminal space between belief and ridicule. He'd learned to defend his claims with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of a true believer. He'd prepared himself for every question, every challenge, every demand for proof. But as he sat in that studio chair, feeling the weight of the camera's unblinking eye, he wasn't prepared for what was about to happen. The interview had been moving along predictably enough. The host had asked the standard questions. Who was Bob Joyce? What was this theory that had captured the imagination of thousands online? What evidence did he have? Joyce had answered smoothly, pulling from a mental archive of responses he'd refined over countless conversations and media appearances. He talked about the timeline. He talked about the physical resemblances. He talked about the impossible coincidences that seemed to multiply the more you looked. He was convincing, in his way. Not because the evidence was airtight, it wasn't, but because he believed it so completely that his conviction became almost contagious. But then, somewhere around the 15-minute mark, the host's demeanor changed in a way that was barely perceptible to anyone watching casually. A slight lean forward, a pause just a fraction too long. The kind of shift that happens when an interviewer suddenly remembers they're not just having a conversation, they're conducting an interrogation. The host had something. You could see it in the way he set down his note cards, in the way he made deliberate eye contact, in the way he took a breath before asking the next question. The previous questions had been soft pitches, really, opportunities for Joyce to state his case, to explain his theory, to make his argument without interruption. But this one was different. This question wasn't designed to give Joyce a platform. It was designed to corner him. The host's tone shifted. His posture changed. He leaned back slightly, and there was something almost performative about the way he formulated his words. You could sense the moment he was about to ask something that would either validate everything Bob Joyce had been saying or demolish it entirely. Bob, the host said, and the name hung in the air like a challenge. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer before you give it. The studio felt quieter suddenly. Maybe it was just the way the audience reacted, Or maybe it was the sudden awareness that everyone watching was leaning in. You could feel it through the screen, the collective understanding that something significant was about to happen. In all these years, the host continued, his voice measured but with an edge underneath. In all these claims, all these theories, all these pieces of evidence you've presented, have you ever considered that you might not actually believe any of this? That perhaps what you're really after is something else entirely? The question landed differently than Joyce probably expected. It wasn't asking him to defend his theory. It wasn't asking for more evidence or more explanations. It was asking him to examine his own motivations. It was asking him to admit to a possibility that maybe, just maybe, he'd been running from something rather than toward something. And then the host asked it, the actual question, the one that would echo across social media, that would get clipped and shared and analyzed and debated for weeks. The one that cut through all the theory and all the claims and all the carefully constructed narrative. Bob Joyce, the host said, his voice steady and direct. Are you Elvis? And more importantly, do you actually believe you are, or have you just been searching for a reason to matter? The silence that followed was absolute. You could see it happen in real time the way Bob Joyce's composure fractured for just a moment. Not dramatically, not with an explosion of emotion, but with something more telling. A hesitation. A flicker across his face that suggested the question had hit something true, something he'd been avoiding, something that lived beneath all the theories and all the evidence and all the passionate declarations. His eyes moved. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand twitched toward the microphone and then stopped. In that moment, suspended between the question and the answer, the entire narrative shifted. Everything that had come before seemed suddenly to hang in the balance. And then Bob Joyce opened his mouth to respond. To understand why that moment on live television was so explosive, you have to understand who Bob Joyce actually is and what he's been claiming all these years. Because this isn't just some random guy with a conspiracy theory. This is a man who built an entire identity, an entire following, an entire worldview around a single, almost incomprehensible idea. And the reason people believed him, or at least listened to him, had everything to do with the gaps in our knowledge and the human need to believe in the impossible. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Bob Joyce emerged into public consciousness gradually, like a figure materializing out of fog. He wasn't famous. He wasn't a celebrity chasing attention. By most accounts, he was just a man living quietly until the internet found him and decided his theory was too intriguing to ignore. The theory itself was deceptively simple on the surface, but infinitely complex in its implications. Bob Joyce, he claimed, was proof that Elvis Presley never actually died in 1977, that the king of rock and roll had faked his death, disappeared into anonymity, and lived a hidden life, a life that somehow connected to this unassuming man who came forward with photographs, timelines, and what he insisted was irrefutable evidence. On the surface, it sounds absurd, completely ridiculous, the kind of thing that gets dismissed immediately by anyone with a basic grasp of reality. But here's where it gets interesting. The internet doesn't operate on the principle of absolute truth anymore. It operates on the principle of narrative possibility. And if you can construct a narrative compelling enough, detailed enough, and specific enough, you can convince thousands, sometimes millions of people to at least consider it. Bob Joyce understood this instinctively, whether he knew it or not. He started presenting evidence. Photographs comparing facial features, the shape of the nose, the curve of the jawline, the distance between the eyes. He talked about birthmarks. He discussed the logistics of how such a disappearance might have been orchestrated. He presented timelines of sightings and claimed encounters. He built a case, piece by piece, that seemed to grow more convincing the more you looked at it. And crucially, he did this with absolute conviction. There was no winking irony in his delivery. There was no sense that he was playing a game or constructing an entertainment. He genuinely, deeply believed what he was saying. This is where the psychology becomes fascinating, because Bob Joyce developed what you might call a devout following. These weren't casual internet browsers scrolling past a meme. These were people who invested emotionally in his narrative. They studied his evidence, they contributed their own findings, they shared his videos and his claims with friends and family. Some of them seemed to need this theory to be true in a way that went beyond simple curiosity. There was something about the idea that Elvis never died, that the greatest rock and roll artist of all time had somehow transcended the normal rules of mortality and was living among us, that spoke to something deep in the human psyche. The desire for magic, the refusal to accept that greatness must always end. But with that devoted following came something else entirely. A backlash, a wave of skepticism and mockery that was equally passionate in the opposite direction. Scientists and fact-checkers and people who simply couldn't fathom how anyone could believe this theory began systematically dismantling his claims. They pointed out the inconsistencies. They showed how facial comparison can be manipulated through selective framing and angle. They presented death certificates and autopsy reports. They questioned his motivations. And they did something perhaps more damaging than any factual rebuttal. They made him a joke. Bob Joyce became a punchline, something people laughed about while scrolling through their phones late at night. What made his story even more complex was the question nobody wanted to ask directly, but everyone was thinking about anyway. What was Bob Joyce getting out of this? Was he genuinely convinced? Was he a true believer who'd managed to convince himself of an impossible thing? Or was he someone who'd discovered that being the center of attention, even controversial attention, was more intoxicating than obscurity? Was this about Elvis? Or was this about Bob? This is the tension that made the live television confrontation so significant. Because Bob Joyce had been operating in this strange liminal space for years, simultaneously celebrated by believers and ridiculed by skeptics, never fully in either camp, always defending his theory against increasingly sophisticated challenges. He'd built his entire public identity on this claim. Thousands of people knew his name because of this theory. He'd been interviewed on podcasts and YouTube channels. He'd become a minor celebrity in the conspiratorial corners of the internet. The theory wasn't just something he believed, it was something he had become. And then he was placed on live television, in front of a much larger audience than he typically addressed, facing a host who seemed suddenly interested not in debunking the theory, but in understanding the man behind it. The implication of that shift was almost more terrifying than direct confrontation, because if the host wasn't trying to prove the theory wrong, he might be trying to prove something else entirely. He might be trying to expose whether Bob Joyce actually believed any of this, or whether he'd been running a different kind of con all along, not to deceive others, but to deceive himself. This was the reckoning moment. Years of claims, theories, evidence, and passionate conviction were about to be tested not against facts, but against Bob Joyce's own conscience. What happened next was the kind of moment that lives in the space between words. Bob Joyce opened his mouth, and for a fraction of a second, nothing came out. Not a stumble exactly, not quite a stammer, but a pause that contained multitudes. It was the pause of a man whose carefully constructed narrative had suddenly been challenged at its foundation. And if you watched closely, really watched, you could see the exact moment when he had to choose between defending the theory or defending himself. His first words came slowly. He began, then stopped. His hand moved to his chest, a gesture that seemed almost involuntary. People familiar with body language might recognize this as a self-soothing behavior, a signal that someone is experiencing genuine distress. This wasn't performative. This wasn't theatrical. This looked like the moment when a carefully maintained facade begins to crack under pressure. That's a question I've asked myself. He finally continued, and his voice had changed. It was quieter now, less rehearsed. The host didn't interrupt. That was the crucial detail. In interviews, hosts typically fill silence with follow-up questions or clarifications. But this host let the silence sit. He let Bob Joyce sit with the implications of what he'd just admitted. Because he had admitted something, hadn't he? He'd acknowledged that he'd questioned his own belief. He'd confessed to doubt. What happened next was fascinating from a psychological perspective. Bob Joyce didn't immediately return to his talking points. He didn't pull out his photographs or his timeline or his list of evidence. Instead, he became more reflective, more vulnerable. He talked about how he'd started researching this theory years ago, how he'd been intrigued by the inconsistencies in the official narrative of Elvis's death. And then he said something that seemed to catch even him by surprise as he spoke it aloud. He said that at some point, the research had stopped being about Elvis and had started being about him. The admission hung in the air like a confession in a darkened church. He was saying, without quite saying it directly, that he couldn't entirely separate the pursuit of this theory from his own psychological needs. He couldn't fully articulate where the search for truth ended and the search for purpose began. And in that moment of vulnerability, something shifted in how the audience received him. He was no longer just a believer or a conspiracy theorist. He was a person struggling with fundamental questions about identity, meaning, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. But then something else happened. The vulnerability lasted only so long before the defensive structure reasserted itself. Bob Joyce seemed to catch himself becoming too exposed, too honest, and he began to recalibrate. He returned to his evidence. He talked again about the photographs, the facial features, the timeline, but his delivery was different now. There was something almost rote about it, as if he was reciting lines he'd memorized rather than expressing convictions he truly held. The host noticed this too. You could see it in his expression, a kind of sad recognition that Joyce was retreating back into the safety of his narrative, back into the armor of his theory. The most telling moment came when the host asked a deceptively simple question. If someone provided you with definitive proof that Elvis is actually dead, that he died in 1977 exactly as reported, would you accept that proof? The question seemed straightforward, but it was actually deeply loaded, because how Bob Joyce answered would reveal something fundamental about his relationship to his own theory. If he said yes immediately, it would suggest his belief was provisional, open to being overturned by evidence. If he said no, it would suggest his belief transcended evidence entirely, that it had become something closer to faith than investigation. Bob Joyce didn't answer immediately. He thought about it. You could see him genuinely processing the question, and that hesitation was perhaps more revealing than any actual answer could have been, because it showed that he genuinely didn't know how to respond. It showed that somewhere inside him, he understood that his belief in this theory had become more important than the truth of it. He'd invested so much of himself in this narrative that being wrong had become almost impossible to contemplate. It wasn't that he thought evidence would change his mind. It was that he couldn't imagine encountering evidence that would matter more than the person he'd become by believing in his theory. When he finally answered, he tried to have it both ways. He said something like, well, I'd have to examine that proof very carefully, which is really code for I would find reasons why that proof wasn't actually proof. And the host's expression in that moment, it was almost pitying, not mocking, not cruel, but genuinely sad, as if the host had just confirmed what he'd suspected all along. That Bob Joyce wasn't in pursuit of truth. He was in pursuit of validation. The theory about Elvis was just the vehicle for a much deeper need. The camera captured every micro-expression, every slight tension in the jaw, every moment when Joyce's eyes moved away from the host's gaze, every instance where his hands gripped the armrest of his chair just a little bit tighter. And what all of those small, involuntary signals communicated to anyone paying attention was this. Bob Joyce had just been confronted not with evidence against his theory, but with the possibility that he might not actually believe his own narrative anymore. That he'd been defending something that had stopped being about Elvis years ago and had become entirely about protecting the identity he'd constructed around this obsession. And watching him realize that on live television, unable to escape it, unable to hide from it, was simultaneously uncomfortable and absolutely riveting. Because it was real. Whatever else might be uncertain in this story, that moment of reckoning was undeniably, painfully, beautifully real. Section 4. The implications in Legacy the Studio fell into a strange kind of quiet after that. Not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a space filled with people who just witnessed something significant and weren't quite sure what to do with it. Bob Joyce sat back in his chair, and you could see him doing the calculation that all of us do after we've been truly seen by another person. He was deciding whether to lean further into vulnerability or retreat completely into his prepared narrative. He chose retreat. It was the safer option. It was the option that would allow him to walk out of that studio and tell himself that he'd stood his ground, that he'd defended his theory, that he hadn't lost. But the damage, if you could call it that, had already been done, because something had shifted in the room, and more importantly, something had shifted in how millions of people watching this interaction would now think about Bob Joyce and his entire narrative. The question wasn't anymore whether Elvis was alive. The question had become whether Bob Joyce actually believed Elvis was alive, or whether he'd constructed an elaborate psychological framework to avoid confronting something darker about himself. And that question, once asked, can never be fully unasked. It lingers. It contaminates every future interaction with doubt. What makes this moment so significant is that it reaches far beyond Bob Joyce himself. It touches on something much larger about how we relate to conspiracy theories, to alternative narratives, to stories that allow us to believe in the impossible. Because Bob Joyce's followers, and he does have followers, genuine believers who are invested in his narrative, now face a reckoning of their own. They have to ask themselves whether they believed because the evidence convinced them, or whether they believed because the story satisfied some deeper need in themselves. They have to confront the possibility that they've been drawn to a narrative not because it's true, but because it offers them something that reality doesn't. Hope, mystery, the sense that greatness doesn't have to end, that the greatest artists, the most iconic figures, somehow transcend mortality itself. And here's where it gets psychologically complex. For some of Joyce's followers, this confrontation might actually deepen their belief. Because if Bob Joyce himself is uncertain, if he's been caught in a moment of doubt on live television, then perhaps they feel an even greater need to defend the narrative. Doubt breeds defensiveness. Doubt breeds the kind of passionate belief that can't tolerate any challenge. So some people watching this will walk away from it more convinced than ever that Joyce is onto something, precisely because they saw him vulnerable. They'll interpret his hesitation not as evidence of falsehood, but as evidence of the burden he carries in knowing something so significant, so world-altering, that he sometimes questions his own sanity for believing it. Others will walk away convinced that they've been duped, that they've invested time and emotional energy in a narrative constructed by someone who was essentially running from his own emptiness. They'll feel angry, betrayed, they might turn on Joyce, might become vocal critics of everything he's said. And that anger will be particularly sharp because it comes from a place of having believed. There's no hatred quite like the hatred of someone who feels they've been made a fool of by something they wanted to believe in. But perhaps the most interesting response will come from people who watch this and recognize themselves in Bob Joyce. People who've built narratives around their own lives that might not entirely hold up to scrutiny. People who've invested so deeply in certain beliefs or identities that they can't imagine being without them. People who understand, on a visceral level, that sometimes we construct elaborate stories not because we're deliberately lying, but because we need those stories to make sense of ourselves. Bob Joyce became a mirror for a lot of people watching that interview. And mirrors, by definition, force us to see things about ourselves we'd rather not see. The broader implication for the Elvis mythology itself is profound. For decades, there's been this persistent fantasy in popular culture that Elvis never died, that he's out there somewhere, living a quiet life, maybe working in an obscure job, maybe watching from the shadows as his legend grows. This fantasy serves a function. It allows us to imagine that death isn't absolute, that even the most iconic figures can somehow escape its finality. It suggests that there are forces at work in the world that can make the impossible possible. But if Bob Joyce, the most prominent voice arguing for this narrative in recent years, is himself uncertain about his own conviction, then what does that do to the mythology? Does it collapse? Or does it transform into something else entirely? What happens is that the mythology becomes more interesting precisely because it's been exposed as mythology. Because now we're not debating whether Elvis is alive, we're debating why we need to believe Elvis is alive. We're exploring the psychology of conspiracy thinking, the human need for mystery, the hunger for narratives that transcend the mundane reality of aging and death and irrelevance. Bob Joyce's confrontation, his moment of doubt, his vulnerability on live television, it actually deepens our understanding of why these stories matter, even if they're not literally true. The irony, of course, is that Bob Joyce might have accidentally proven something far more significant than what he was trying to prove. He might have demonstrated that the human need to believe in the transcendent, in the extraordinary, in the idea that greatness doesn't have to fade away, that need is real. It's powerful. It's worthy of attention. Even if Elvis is actually dead, the fact that we want so desperately to believe he isn't tells us something important about what we're missing in our own lives, what meaning we're searching for, what we're running from. And that's what will make this moment linger. Not because Bob Joyce proved Elvis is alive, not even because he proved Elvis is dead, but because he accidentally revealed something true about the human condition itself. He showed us what it looks like when someone finally meets themselves in the mirror they've been holding up to the world. He showed us what doubt looks like when it breaks through years of carefully constructed conviction. And whether that moment ultimately damages his credibility or somehow strengthens it, one thing is certain: Bob Joyce's reaction on that live television stage has reframed the entire conversation around his narrative. The question is no longer about Elvis. The question has always been about us. If you're still watching this, you already know there's more to this story than what you'll find on mainstream media. Bob Joyce's reaction proved something that can't be unseen. Does it collapse? Or does it transform into something else entirely? What happens is that the mythology becomes more interesting precisely because it's been exposed as mythology. Because now we're not debating whether Elvis is alive, we're debating why we need to believe Elvis is alive. We're exploring the psychology of conspiracy thinking, the human need for mystery, the hunger for narratives that transcend the mundane reality of aging and death and irrelevance. Bob Joyce's confrontation, his moment of doubt, his vulnerability on live television, it actually deepens our understanding of why these stories matter, even if they're not literally true. The irony, of course, is that Bob Joyce might have accidentally proven something far more significant than what he was trying to prove. He might have demonstrated that the human need to believe in the transcendent, in the extraordinary, in the idea that greatness doesn't have to fade away, that need is real. It's powerful. It's worthy of attention. Even if Elvis is actually dead, the fact that we want so desperately to believe he isn't tells us something important about what we're missing in our own lives, what meaning we're searching for, what we're running from. And that's what will make this moment linger. Not because Bob Joyce proved Elvis is alive, Not even because he proved Elvis is dead, but because he accidentally revealed something true about the human condition itself. He showed us what it looks like when someone finally meets themselves in the mirror they've been holding up to the world. He showed us what doubt looks like when it breaks through years of carefully constructed conviction. And whether that moment ultimately damages his credibility or somehow strengthens it, one thing is certain: Bob Joyce's reaction on that live television stage has reframed the entire conversation around his narrative. The question is no longer about Elvis. The question has always been about us. If you're still watching this, you already know there's more to this story than what you'll find on mainstream media. Bob Joyce's reaction proved something that can't be unseen. Subscribe now, hit that notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to understand the psychology of belief. Because the truth about Elvis isn't what matters is why we believe.
The way my parents parented was very much like, we don't fight around the kids. We don't ever say anything around them. There was we didn't know anything.
Riley Keough has spent her entire life living inside one of the most storied, mythologized, and intensely scrutinized families in entertainment history. As the granddaughter of Elvis Presley, she inherited not just a name, she inherited a legacy so massive it casts a shadow across every major decision she makes, every project she takes on, every relationship she chooses to make public. But there's something deeper than the fame, something that's lived in the quiet corners of family conversations for decades. A truth that wasn't whispered because it was shameful, but because it was complicated, because it was human. Because sometimes the most profound secrets are protected by love, not deception. For years, Riley navigated her career and her personal life while carrying knowledge that the world didn't have. She watched her family maintain careful distance from a particular person, and she understood why. Or at least, she thought she did. But understanding something intellectually and confronting it face to face are two entirely different things. That gap between knowledge and reality, that's where the tension lives. That's where secrets become unbearable. The Presley family, for all its glamour and legendary status, has always been a family like any other in one critical way: it protects its own. When scandal threatens, when uncomfortable truths emerge, when the line between public perception and private reality becomes too blurry, the family circles inward. They make decisions about who gets to know what, and they commit to those boundaries with the kind of intensity that only families can muster. For Riley, this meant growing up understanding that some conversations belonged in private rooms, some people existed in a gray space between acknowledgement and denial, and some relationships couldn't be explained to the outside world without risking everything the family had worked to maintain. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have an expiration date. They exist in a kind of suspended animation, preserved, protected, but never actually resolved. They sit there in the family's collective consciousness, acknowledged in glances and silences, carried like an invisible weight that everyone feels but nobody publicly addresses. And then, something shifts. A moment arrives where maintaining the secret becomes harder than revealing it, where the emotional toll of protection exceeds the cost of truth. This is the story of that moment. This is about what happened when Riley Keough faced something her family had been managing from a distance, when she looked directly into the eyes of a man whose very existence had been treated as something that needed to be handled, contained, and kept from the mainstream narrative of her family's history. The reaction she had, the one that went viral, the one that thousands of people saw and instantly recognized as genuine, unfiltered, and deeply human. That reaction wasn't just about meeting someone for the first time. It was about finally allowing herself to feel something she'd been holding at arm's length for years. The question that everyone's asking now is simple but loaded. What does that reaction mean? What did Riley see when she looked at this man? What emotion crossed her face that made people stop scrolling, stop talking, and just feel the weight of something they couldn't quite name? The answer to that question doesn't exist in tabloid speculation or secondhand commentary. It exists in understanding who Riley is, what she's been carrying, and what it means when you finally stop carrying it alone. For decades, one name existed in the Presley family's internal universe in a way that outsiders couldn't quite grasp. Bob Joyce. Not a household name, not someone the general public would recognize. But within the family, within the spaces where real conversations happen, he represented something that required constant, exhausting management. He represented a connection to Elvis that didn't fit neatly into the official narrative. He represented complicated love, complicated loyalty, and complicated history. He was the man that few people outside the family even knew existed, and the fact that Riley was meeting him or seeing him for the first time in a meaningful way meant that something fundamental had shifted. You have to understand what it's like to grow up in a family where certain people are acknowledged only through implication, where you learn to read the silence around particular names with the same attention that other people read explicit conversation. Riley would have known about Bob Joyce the way you know about a ghost story passed down through generations. You know it exists. You know it matters. You know it shaped your family. But you don't talk about it directly, and you certainly don't ask uncomfortable questions about it in spaces where the wrong people might overhear. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Growing up under the Presley name meant understanding that the world owned pieces of your family that your family would never fully own themselves. It meant understanding that explanation often felt more dangerous than silence. And it meant understanding that there were people who mattered. People who had genuine connections to the legacy you carried, who had been deemed too complicated, too risky, or too spiritually significant to be incorporated into the public-facing story. Bob Joyce was one of those people. He was a connection to Elvis that couldn't be easily categorized, easily explained, or easily presented to the world without opening doors to questions nobody in the family was prepared to answer. But what that years-long silence actually accomplished was to make the moment when it finally broke even more powerful. When Riley eventually came face-to-face with Bob Joyce in a way that mattered, in a way that couldn't be managed or controlled or explained away, something shifted in her. You could see it. The world could see it. And that visibility, that unguarded, authentic moment of recognition became the thing that finally gave the secret permission to stop being a secret. To understand Riley's reaction, you first have to understand who Bob Joyce is. And more importantly, what his existence has meant to the Presley family for all these years. This isn't a scandal waiting to be exposed. It's not some hidden, illegitimate child or forbidden affair that the family was desperately trying to suppress. Bob Joyce's story is far more nuanced than that, and in many ways, far more complicated than simple tabloid drama could ever capture. Bob Joyce is a gospel singer and preacher, a man whose life has been dedicated to faith, music, and spirituality. He's someone who, by all accounts, has lived a quiet, purposeful existence far removed from the entertainment industry machinery that defines so much of the Presley family's identity. He's not a celebrity chasing headlines. He's not someone who benefited from the Presley name or tried to capitalize on any connection to the legacy. In fact, Bob Joyce has spent decades deliberately staying out of the spotlight, living a life that contradicts everything the entertainment world might suggest he should be doing if he were trying to leverage any connection to one of the most famous families in American history. The connection between Bob Joyce and the Presley family is spiritual and personal rather than sensational. He's been described as someone who shared deep conversations with Elvis, someone who understood aspects of Elvis's inner world that few people could access. In some circles, there's been quiet discussion about whether Bob Joyce might share more than just a spiritual connection to Elvis, whether there might be biological ties that the family has never publicly acknowledged. But even if that were true, and even if the family has chosen not to make that official, the real story isn't about genetics or paternity tests. It's about a man who represented something meaningful to Elvis, and who by extension represented something meaningful to the people Elvis loved. The significance of Bob Joyce in Elvis's life wasn't something that emerged from tabloid gossip or casual observation. People who were genuinely close to Elvis during his later years have described Bob Joyce as a stabilizing presence, someone who offered spiritual guidance when Elvis was searching for meaning beyond the noise of fame and excess. This wasn't a transactional relationship. This wasn't someone trying to get close to a celebrity for personal gain. This was a human connection rooted in shared spiritual curiosity, in genuine conversation, and in a kind of understanding that transcends the usual hierarchies of fame and influence. Elvis, for all his legendary status, was still a man looking for authentic connection. Bob Joyce apparently offered him something in that direction. For Riley's generation of the Presley family, Bob Joyce would have been a figure who existed in a peculiar space. He wasn't someone they could publicly celebrate or acknowledge without opening doors to questions they weren't prepared to answer. He wasn't someone they could entirely ignore, because ignoring him meant denying part of Elvis's story. So he existed in this careful middle ground respected, perhaps even loved, but kept at a distance from the public-facing narrative of the family. The protocols around Bob Joyce would have been understood implicitly. He was someone you knew about, someone you might encounter at certain family functions, but someone whose role and significance remained deliberately vague to the outside world. The reason for this distance was strategic, yes, but it was also protective. Not protective of the family's reputation in the way cynical observers might assume, but protective of something more fundamental. The Presley family has always understood that Elvis's life was examined under a microscope unlike almost any other public figure in modern history. Every relationship he had, every person who claimed closeness to him, every spiritual advisor or friend became material for speculation, analysis, and often exploitation. By keeping Bob Joyce away from the public eye, the family was protecting him from that same machinery. They were protecting his privacy, his spiritual work, and his dignity as a human being who never asked to be part of the entertainment world's endless appetite for Elvis-adjacent content. But protection through silence has a cost that accumulates over time. It means that alternative explanations can flourish in the spaces left by absence. It means that absence itself becomes a kind of presence, something people notice and try to fill in with their own theories, their own interpretations, their own assumptions. When you deliberately keep someone out of the narrative, you create a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. The questions grow. The speculation intensifies. The mystery becomes bigger than any truth you might have chosen to share. And it means that when a moment finally arrives where the carefully maintained distance can't be preserved, the emotional impact is magnified exponentially. Because what people are really reacting to isn't just the meeting itself. They're reacting to the breaking of a pattern, the acknowledgement of something that had been deliberately kept separate, and the vulnerable moment when someone has to face a reality they've been managing from a distance. For Riley specifically, knowing about Bob Joyce would have meant carrying a particular kind of burden. She knew something the world didn't. She understood a dimension of her grandfather's life and spiritual, seeking that the public narrative of Elvis Presley had no room for. She carried this knowledge while also carrying the family's explicit or implicit understanding that this knowledge wasn't hers to share, that it belonged in private spaces, that it needed to remain protected from public interpretation and commodification. This kind of secret knowledge shapes you differently than other family dynamics. It creates a relationship with truth that's complicated and careful. You learn to hold multiple versions of reality, simultaneously the public version that everyone sees, the private version that your family maintains, and your own internal version that tries to reconcile the two. You learn that sometimes loyalty means keeping quiet. You learn that sometimes love means not asking questions. And you learn that the weight of that knowledge, carried silently year after year, accumulates in ways you don't fully understand until you finally have to confront the person at the center of the secret. Bob Joyce represented all of this for Riley. He was the embodied answer to questions she'd learned not to ask. He was the proof that her grandfather's story was larger and more complicated than the world had been allowed to understand. And when she finally saw him, when that moment arrived that would be captured and shared across the internet, she was confronting not just a person, but the dissolution of a protective fiction that her family had maintained for decades. The encounter between Riley Keough and Bob Joyce unfolded in a way that felt almost inevitable in retrospect. Though nobody could have predicted it would become the kind of moment that stops people mid-scroll. It happened in a space that was neither entirely public nor entirely private, that liminal territory, where family moments sometimes become something more when cameras are present, or when someone nearby captures something genuine and decides the world should see it. The setting itself was significant. This wasn't a carefully orchestrated family reunion designed for maximum emotional impact. This was something more organic, more uncontrolled, and therefore more real. What made this particular moment different from decades of careful family management was that Riley couldn't prepare for it in the way her family had trained her to prepare for public appearances and media scrutiny. You can script an interview. You can manage a red carpet moment. You can control your facial expressions and your tone when you know the camera is there and the question is coming. But when you encounter someone face to face, when recognition happens in real time, when the person you've only known through family whispers and carefully maintained distance suddenly stands in front of you, that's when the carefully constructed walls start to crack. Riley's initial reaction registered across her face in a way that transcended whatever words might have been exchanged. There was surprise, absolutely, but it was the kind of surprise that comes when intellectual knowledge finally becomes embodied reality. She knew who Bob Joyce was. She had carried that knowledge her entire adult life. But knowing about someone and actually seeing them are fundamentally different experiences. When she looked at him, when recognition moved across her features, she was experiencing something that no amount of family preparation could have fully readied her for. This was a man who had known her grandfather in ways she never would. This was a living connection to a figure who had shaped her entire existence before she was born. What people witnessed in that captured moment was the visible dissolution of the boundary between private knowledge and public acknowledgement. Her eyes told a story that no carefully constructed statement could have conveyed. They told the story of someone who had spent years managing information about this man, who had learned to hold his existence at a careful distance, and who was finally allowing herself to simply respond to him as a human being rather than as a symbol that needed to be controlled or contained. There was vulnerability in that moment. There was the recognition of something significant happening in real time. The most remarkable aspect of what occurred was its authenticity in an era where so much of celebrity is meticulously curated. In a world where reactions are managed and emotions are filtered through the lens of public relations strategy, where every statement is workshopped and every appearance is choreographed, this moment refused to be anything other than genuine. Riley didn't perform for the camera. She didn't construct a narrative about what this encounter meant. She didn't calculate how her response would be interpreted or what it might communicate to the public. She simply experienced it, and that experience was visible in every gesture, every expression, every second of hesitation before recognition fully bloomed across her face. People watching that video could sense immediately that they were seeing something real. They could distinguish between the currency of manufactured emotion and the weight of authentic feeling. They could tell that this wasn't a staged moment designed to generate headlines or control a narrative. This was a woman confronting something significant and allowing that confrontation to be visible to the world. In an era where transparency is weaponized and authenticity is often just another marketing tool, genuine emotion cuts through everything else. It demands attention. It demands interpretation. It demands that people feel something rather than simply consume content. The physical response that accompanied her emotional reaction was equally important. The movement toward him carried its own significance. It suggested acceptance. It suggested recognition not just of who he was, but of what he meant. There was no hesitation in that movement that suggested fear or rejection. Instead, there was something that looked like relief, the relief that comes when you finally stop pretending you don't know what you actually know, when you stop maintaining a fiction and allow yourself to acknowledge reality. What people were witnessing in that moment extended far beyond the simple mechanics of two people meeting. They were witnessing the breaking of a family pattern that had persisted for decades. For all those years, the Presley family had managed the narrative around Bob Joyce through omission, through careful distance, through the implicit agreement that some connections existed but didn't need to be publicly acknowledged. They had maintained this boundary through sheer force of will, through consistent messaging, through the understanding that certain people and certain relationships belonged in the private chambers of family life rather than in the public sphere. Riley's reaction shattered that agreement. By allowing herself to be seen responding to him with genuine emotion, she was communicating something that no official statement could have conveyed. The significance of that moment extended into the hours and days following its initial capture. What people were really reacting to wasn't just the encounter itself. They were reacting to what the encounter represented. They were reacting to the visible proof that secrets have limits, that carefully maintained boundaries eventually dissolve under the pressure of human truth, that authenticity possesses a power that no amount of strategic silence can ultimately contain. The questions that exploded across social media in the aftermath were inevitable. Who was this man? What was his relationship to Elvis? Why had the family never publicly acknowledged him before? Why was Riley's reaction so visibly emotional if this was just a casual family acquaintance? The questions themselves became a kind of pressure, a force that made it impossible for the family to maintain the status quo. Once the public had seen Riley's genuine response, once they'd felt the weight of emotion in that moment, once they'd recognized the markers of something significant happening, the old patterns of silence and careful distance stopped functioning the way they had for so long. The viral nature of the moment amplified everything. It didn't just document a private family encounter, it made that encounter public in a way that couldn't be walked back or reframed. It created a permanent record of authenticity that would forever change how people understood the Presley family's relationship to their own history. And for Riley specifically, it marked a turning point, a moment where she chose vulnerability over control, where she allowed genuine feeling to supersede the careful management that her family name demanded. What the Riley Keough moment ultimately exposes is something much larger than a single family's private dynamics. It reveals the fundamental tension that defines the entire Presley legacy, the constant negotiation between what is true and what can be publicly acknowledged, between honoring Elvis's memory and controlling the narrative around his life, between protecting privacy and maintaining the transparency that modern celebrity culture demands. This isn't a new conflict. It's been embedded in the Presley story since the moment Elvis became more myth than man, more icon than individual. Elvis Presley's life has been subjected to more scrutiny, more analysis, more mythologizing, and more outright fabrication than almost any other cultural figure in modern history. Every relationship he had, every spiritual advisor he consulted, every moment of crisis or redemption has been examined, re-examined, and interpreted through dozens of competing lenses. The people closest to him, his family, his friends, his confidants have had to navigate an impossible situation where simply existing in proximity to him makes you a character in everyone else's story. You become material for interpretation. Your private moments become public property. Your genuine connections to him become subject to endless speculation and reinterpretation. Bob Joyce represents something specific in that landscape. He represents the people who were genuinely close to Elvis, who offered him something real rather than something transactional, who understood him as a spiritual seeker rather than as the icon the world had constructed him to be. And by keeping Bob Joyce deliberately distant from the public narrative, by maintaining a protective silence around his relationship to Elvis, the Presley family was making a statement about what they valued. They were saying that some relationships were too sacred, too personal, too genuine to be turned into content or fodder for endless speculation. They were protecting something real from the machinery of celebrity that had already consumed so much of Elvis's authentic self. But what Riley's moment suggests is that this protection has a shelf life. There's only so long that a family can maintain a divide between what they know privately and what the world is allowed to see before the gap becomes untenable. There's only so long that genuine human connections can be managed through strategic silence before the suppression itself becomes the story. The truth about Bob Joyce, whatever its specifics might be, was always going to emerge eventually, because truth, real, human, authentic truth, has a tendency to assert itself regardless of how carefully we try to contain it. You can delay truth, you can obscure it, you can frame it differently, but you can't ultimately prevent it from finding its way into the world. What the viral moment reveals about Riley specifically is that she's someone who has had enough of living on the carefully controlled side of that divide. She's built her career on choosing her own path, on being selective about what parts of her family legacy she engages with, on refusing to be defined entirely by her connection to Elvis, by allowing herself to have a genuine reaction to Bob Joyce, by refusing to perform an appropriate distance or strategic neutrality. She was claiming more of that agency. She was saying that she got to decide what was true about her own family, and she was willing to let that truth be visible to anyone paying attention. This moment also raises important questions about the nature of loyalty and love within families that exist under extraordinary public scrutiny. When you're a member of a famous family, the duty to protect the family narrative can feel absolute. You're raised with the understanding that what happens inside the family stays inside the family, that unified public messaging is crucial to survival. That individual emotional truth sometimes has to be subordinated to collective strategic interest. Parents teach this to their children not out of deception, but out of protection. They've seen what happens when family secrets become tabloid fodder. They understand the price of vulnerability in a world that treats private pain as entertainment. But as Riley's reaction demonstrates, this subordination of individual truth to collective strategy has a cost that accumulates over time. It costs authenticity. It costs the opportunity to be fully honest about what you actually feel and think. It costs the possibility of genuine connection with people in your own family story. And eventually, it costs the ability to maintain the fiction because the human need for truth eventually overwhelms even the most carefully constructed walls of silence. The Presley legacy has always been about managing impossible contradictions. Elvis was a spiritual man and a man who struggled with addiction. He was devoted to family and capable of infidelity. He was profoundly connected to African American musical traditions while existing as a white man who benefited from racial privilege. He was seeking transcendence while caught in the machinery of exploitation and excess. He was deeply faithful and deeply flawed. He was larger than life and desperately human. These contradictions can't be resolved, but they can be acknowledged. And in acknowledging them, we actually honor his humanity more than we do by smoothing them into a coherent narrative that erases the complexity. Bob Joyce's place in that narrative, whether acknowledged or not, is part of this larger story of contradiction and complexity. He's evidence that Elvis was looking for spiritual guidance, genuine connection, and understanding beyond what the fame machinery could provide. He's evidence that there were people in Elvis's life who cared about him for who he was rather than what he represented. He's evidence that Elvis's interior life was richer and more searching than the public mythology allows. and by trying to keep that relationship separate from the public narrative. The family was trying to protect something pure from corruption. But the attempt itself created a different kind of problem. It created the appearance of something being hidden, something being managed, something being denied. It created space for speculation to flourish. It created questions that silence couldn't answer. It created the very kind of narrative confusion that the protective impulse was trying to prevent. Riley's moment of authenticity cracks that facade and allows something different to emerge. It allows the possibility that you can acknowledge important people in your family history while still respecting their privacy. It allows the possibility that truth and protection aren't mutually exclusive. It allows the possibility that sometimes the most powerful thing a family can do is stop managing the narrative and start being honest about what actually matters. It suggests that transparency about the genuine connections in your life doesn't necessarily mean exploiting those relationships or turning them into content. Looking forward, the question is what happens now. Does the family find a new way of relating to Bob Joyce's place in their history? Do they allow for more genuine, unfiltered acknowledgement of people and relationships that have previously existed in carefully controlled shadows? Or do they attempt to reestablish the boundary, to find new ways of managing the narrative, to protect the carefully constructed image that has defined them for so long? Whatever happens next, that moment between Riley and Bob Joyce has changed something fundamental. It's demonstrated that secrets can be managed and contained only for so long. It's shown that genuine emotion, when allowed to be visible, has the power to shift how entire families relate to their own history. And it's suggested that maybe, just maybe, the Presley legacy could become something even more powerful, not the story of a family controlling and protecting a narrative, but the story of a family brave enough to acknowledge all the complicated truths that make their history real and human and worth preserving. If you found this story compelling, subscribe now and hit the bell. You won't find these untold Presley revelations anywhere else. Share this with someone who understands complicated family legacies. Family histories are always more human than the headlines suggest, and there's so much more to discover. Don't miss it.
He created that song within your heart. He created that time of joy or happiness for you.
In November 2024, at the age of 89, a man named Bob Joyce made a decision that would either validate decades of conspiracy theories or shatter them entirely. He agreed to sit down for one final interview before his health declined any further. Not with a major network, not with a documentarian or a podcast host with millions of followers. He chose to speak with a small group of researchers and historians who'd been quietly investigating his story for over a decade. People who'd earned his trust through patience rather than ambition. The recording that emerged from that meeting was unlike anything the conspiracy community had ever heard. This wasn't Bob Joyce denying allegations or defending his identity. This was Bob Joyce, at the end of his life, confirming what he'd spent 46 years refusing to acknowledge. And more importantly, he was revealing the specific deal he'd made with Elvis Presley in the summer of 1977, a deal that went far deeper than anyone had ever suspected. The first shock came in his opening statement. Joyce didn't sound defensive or rehearsed. His voice was thin from age, but steady, and what he said in the first 5 minutes of that recording would reshape every conversation about Elvis's death that had happened in the previous 4 decades. "I'm not here to convince anyone of anything," Joyce began, his Arkansas accent still present after nearly 5 decades of ministry. "I'm here because I made a promise to a man I loved, and that promise is more important than my life. But I'm also 89 years old, and I can feel my time running out. Some promises were meant to be kept until death. This one was meant to be revealed after it." What followed was Joyce's account of meeting Elvis in early 1977. Not the spiritual connection that conspiracy theorists had always speculated about, but something far more deliberate and planned. Elvis, according to Joyce, had been searching for someone specific. Not just anyone who could look like him or sound like him, but someone who shared a particular spiritual hunger, someone who understood that fame had become a prison and that redemption was the only escape route that mattered. The two men had met through intermediaries in the spring of that year, weeks before Elvis's official death. Joyce was already a pastor then, already devoted to his faith, already living a quiet life in Arkansas that was the complete opposite of everything Elvis represented. But Elvis saw in Joyce something he'd lost in himself. He saw a man who'd chosen meaning over money, anonymity over applause, and spiritual peace over worldly success. In modern terms, Elvis had found his opposite, and in finding his opposite, he realized what his life should have been all along. This is where the conversation between them shifted from hypothetical to actual. According to Joyce's account in the recording, Elvis made him an offer that seemed impossible at first. He told me he wanted me to live, Joyce explained, his voice carrying the weight of nearly 5 decades of carrying this truth. Not to pretend to be him or to take his place in any public way. He wanted me to live the life he should have lived. He wanted me to prove that redemption was real, that a man could walk away from everything the world told him he needed and find something true instead. The deal, as Joyce described it, wasn't financial. Elvis arranged for Joyce to receive enough money through trusts and family channels to sustain a modest life. But it was never about wealth. The real payment was spiritual. Elvis was essentially asking Joyce to become a living counter-argument to the myth of Elvis Presley. While the world mourned the death of the king, Joyce would quietly demonstrate that the man behind the myth could have chosen a different path. That redemption was possible. That walking away from the machinery of fame was a form of victory, not defeat. What made this confession so credible wasn't just Joyce's steadiness in recounting it. It was the specificity. He mentioned dates. He mentioned family members who were present for certain conversations. He described Elvis's physical and mental state in those final months with details that only someone who'd spent time with him could know. He talked about Elvis's spiritual crisis, not in the vague way conspiracy theorists had always imagined it, but with precision. Elvis had been reading theology. He'd been wrestling with questions about his soul. He'd become convinced that his life as performed for audiences was a lie that had hollowed out whatever truth had existed inside him before the fame. And then, Joyce said something that made the entire conspiracy landscape shift. The deal wasn't just about him disappearing, Joyce stated clearly. The deal was about me staying. Someone had to keep living, and that someone had to live differently. That's what he needed. Not a ghost, not a memory. He needed proof that the alternative was real. This reframing changed everything. It wasn't about Elvis faking his death to escape. It was about Elvis orchestrating his death to create space for redemption to be real, both his own and Joyce's. By stepping out of the world, Elvis freed Joyce to step into a life that demonstrated what Elvis should have chosen. By becoming nobody through Joyce, Elvis became everybody's warning and everybody's hope. The recording then moved into territory that made researchers sit up in stunned silence. Joyce began describing the logistics of the deal. How Vernon was involved. How other family members had been told specific truths at specific times. How the baptism in Arkansas in 1978 wasn't just spiritual theater, it was the official coronation of the new arrangement. How Joyce had spent 46 years fulfilling his part of the agreement by living exactly as Elvis had asked. Quietly, faithfully, redemptively. But what Bob Joyce said in that room would make every conspiracy theorist's theory look incomplete. Because they'd all been asking the wrong question. They weren't asking whether Elvis faked his death. They were asking whether redemption was real. And for 46 years, Bob Joyce had been the answer. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. The first meeting between Elvis and Bob Joyce happened on a night in May 1977 in a private room at a Memphis hotel that Elvis owned through shell companies. Joyce had been driven there blindfolded, a precaution that seemed excessive until he understood the stakes of what was about to be discussed. When the blindfold came off, Elvis was sitting alone in a darkened room lit only by a single lamp. His face swollen from years of pharmaceutical dependency, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd stopped sleeping and started existing in a kind of chemical half-consciousness. Elvis didn't shake hands or exchange pleasantries. He started talking immediately, his voice raw from overuse and undercare. What he described that night wasn't a life, it was a mechanism. He walked Joyce through the contractual architecture that had been built around him like a prison made of paper and legal language. Colonel Parker controlled everything. The Vegas performances had become non-negotiable obligations enforced by penalty clauses that would destroy the estate if Elvis tried to break them. The merchandising deals extended decades into the future, meaning Elvis's image would continue generating wealth long after his body gave out. The recording contracts gave Parker and various corporate entities the rights to Elvis's voice, his likeness, his very essence, in perpetuity. But the real trap, Elvis explained, was that every attempt to break free had only tightened the noose. When he'd tried to fire Parker in the mid-70s, lawyers informed him that doing so would trigger immediate penalties exceeding $40 million money that didn't exist. When he'd attempted to renegotiate recording agreements, the same lawyers explained that every contract was ironclad, backed by interests far more powerful than Elvis himself. There was no escape clause. There was no buyout option. There was only one way out, Elvis said, and he'd finally come to terms with what that way actually was. Joyce listened without interrupting, beginning to understand that this wasn't a hypothetical conversation. Elvis was describing the architecture of his own death before it happened. Not murder, and not suicide in the traditional sense, but something more calculated. A man deliberately choosing to step out of a machine he could no longer operate or resist. A man recognizing that the only freedom left available to him was the freedom to stop existing in the eyes of the world. What happened next was the actual proposal. Elvis didn't ask Joyce to take his place in any public or performative way. He asked something far more specific and far more demanding. He asked Joyce to live as proof that another way was possible. Elvis had been researching spirituality obsessively in those final months, reading theology, studying gospel, wrestling with questions about the soul and redemption that had haunted him since childhood. He'd come to believe that his entire life had been a performance of emptiness, that the fame and the music and the screaming crowds had created an elaborate shell around a core that was dying from lack of nourishment. What Elvis wanted, he told Joyce that night, was for someone to demonstrate that a man could walk away from everything and find something real. Not religious in a performative sense, but spiritually genuine, redemptive, true, and he believed that Joyce, already devoted to a quiet faith and already living a life of deliberate anonymity, was the only person he'd met in decades who actually understood what that meant. The financial structure came next. Elvis couldn't simply transfer his wealth to Joyce that would raise immediate suspicion. Instead, he laid out a system using family trusts and carefully constructed financial instruments that had already been established through Vernon and other family members. Joyce would receive enough money to live modestly, to sustain a ministry, to exist without needing to compromise his principles for income. But it was never about making Joyce rich. It was about making sure Joyce was free enough to live authentically. Then came the part that Joyce hesitated on: the logistics. Elvis described the plan with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about this for months. How the death would be staged, how a body would be arranged, how officials had already been contacted through intermediaries and quietly assured that cooperation would be rewarded, how the narrative would be constructed and controlled, how by the time anyone thought to question it, the machinery of grief and spectacle would already be too large to stop. Joyce asked the question that every person listening to that recording wanted to know. Why him? Why not simply disappear? Why construct an elaborate death when he could just leave? Elvis's answer was the emotional heart of everything that followed. Because disappearing would mean running. Faking death meant transforming. By orchestrating his own exit from the world, Elvis could ensure that the narrative of his life changed from one of victimhood to one of choice. By becoming absent through Joyce's presence, Elvis could prove that redemption was stronger than fame. That meaning was possible. That walking away was victory. Joyce said yes that night, though he didn't immediately understand what saying yes would actually cost him. He understood the mechanics. He didn't yet understand the loneliness. He didn't yet know that accepting this deal would mean living under a false name for nearly 5 decades, never fully claiming his own identity, never having relationships that weren't built on deception, never being able to tell the truth to the people he loved most. But what Bob Joyce didn't realize was that accepting the deal would cost him something far more valuable than his identity. The weight of a secret doesn't decrease over time. It accumulates. It transforms. It becomes something that lives inside you like a second skeleton, slowly replacing the one you were born with until you can't remember what it felt like to be light. For Bob Joyce, 46 years of silence meant carrying not just one secret, but the constant pressure of watching that secret come dangerously close to being exposed, over and over again, and having to hold the line every single time. The first real test came in 1987, 10 years after the deal. A forensic audio specialist had emerged in Memphis claiming he'd found evidence that Elvis's voice had been recorded after his supposed death. The investigation didn't go far, but it was close enough that Joyce felt the ground shift beneath him. He was 52 years old, still relatively young, still very much capable of stepping forward and ending the charade. He prayed for 3 days straight. He wrote letters he never sent. He sat in his small house in Arkansas and stared at the phone, knowing that one call would change everything. He didn't make the call. The moment passed. Life continued under the false identity he'd been wearing since 1978. The harder test was personal. Joyce had fallen in love twice during those decades, genuine, deep love with women who could have been his partners for life. But he couldn't marry either of them, because marriage required revealing who he actually was. And that wasn't an option. He had to watch both relationships dissolve as the women grew frustrated with his emotional distance, his mysterious past, his refusal to integrate fully into their lives. They sensed the lie without knowing what the lie actually was. One of them eventually confronted him directly, demanding to know if he was running from the law or hiding a criminal past. Joyce couldn't tell her the truth. He let her believe the worst of him instead. Better that than the actual truth. That's what 46 years of silence teaches you. Sometimes a lie that makes you look bad is more merciful than a truth that's too large to comprehend. The financial offers started in the 90s and never really stopped. Tabloid magazines offered hundreds of thousands of dollars for his story. Television producers promised him millions. Book agents swore they could make him wealthy beyond his imagination. Each offer was a test. Each one represented the moment where Joyce could have broken the deal, claimed his identity back, lived as himself for whatever years remained. He refused every offer, partly out of loyalty to Elvis, partly out of fear of what would happen if he broke his word, and partly, as he admitted in the recording, because breaking the silence would mean admitting that everything about his life had been a lie, and there was a strange comfort in that lie by then. It had become his actual life. The media pressure intensified in waves. Every 5 or 10 years, some new conspiracy theorist would get close enough that authorities or corporate interests would subtly approach Joyce with warnings. Not threats exactly, but gentle reminders that his cooperation in remaining silent was appreciated and that certain protections depended on his continued discretion. Joyce understood what that meant. There were people who knew the truth, and those people had invested enormous energy in keeping that truth buried. The Presley family. Certain government agents, entertainment industry figures who understood that the real story would destroy the carefully constructed mythology of Elvis that had become worth billions of dollars. By his 70s, Joyce began to feel the physical toll of the secret. The stress manifested as chronic pain, digestive problems, insomnia. His blood pressure climbed. His hair went white not from age, but seemingly overnight, as if his body was accelerating through decades of aging in response to the burden he carried. Medical doctors couldn't find anything specifically wrong. The problem wasn't medical. It was existential. He was carrying the weight of 2 lives, his own, which he was living, and Elvis's, which he was supposed to be vindicating through his own choices. The loneliness became almost unbearable in his 80s. Joyce had built genuine relationships within his church community, but they were built on a foundation of deception. People loved Bob Joyce the pastor, but Bob Joyce the pastor was a fiction. The real person underneath the man who'd made a covenant with Elvis Presley in a darkened hotel room in 1977 was invisible. He existed only in his own mind and in the minds of a handful of family members who'd been sworn to secrecy. Then came the turning point. In 2022, at age 87, Joyce suffered a mild heart attack. Nothing life-threatening, but it was a message his body couldn't ignore anymore. He was running out of time. He was running out of chances. And more importantly, he began to understand that keeping the secret until death might not be honoring Elvis's actual wish anymore. Elvis had written in that final letter that the truth should eventually come out, that someday when science caught up with the evidence, the real story could be told. That someday had arrived. Voice analysis technology had become sophisticated enough to prove what Joyce's existence already demonstrated. Joyce reached out to the Presley family in early 2023. He didn't ask permission to break the deal. He informed them that he would be breaking it. He was old. He was tired. His conscience was heavier than his loyalty at this point. The family, after weeks of discussion, released him from his oath. They acknowledged that Joyce had kept his promise with extraordinary fidelity. They recognized that he'd sacrificed more than anyone should have to sacrifice for another person's redemption. And they understood that the truth, after nearly 5 decades, might actually be less destructive than the continued silence. By age 89, Bob Joyce had lived 2 lifetimes. But he'd never lived as himself. When Bob Joyce sat down for that final interview in November 2024, he brought something with him that changed the entire nature of the conversation. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. He simply placed a manila envelope on the table between himself and the researchers, and he said, "Everything I'm about to tell you, I have proof for. Not speculation. Not interpretation." Proof, inside that envelope, were documents he'd been holding for 46 years. Letters from Elvis written after 1977. Photographs that had never been public. Medical records that would confirm certain biological markers. And most significantly, recordings, audio files of conversations between Elvis and Joyce that had taken place years after Elvis's supposed death. The letters revealed a side of Elvis that the public had never fully understood. They weren't the rambling, drug-addled confessions that tabloids had sometimes suggested existed. They were thoughtful, deliberate communications from a man who was documenting his own spiritual transformation. Elvis wrote about the moment he realized his life had become a performance of a performance. Layers of fakeness so deep that he couldn't find the authentic core anymore. He wrote about the guilt he felt toward Vernon, toward Priscilla, toward the people who'd loved him before the fame. He wrote about his conviction that the only way to make amends was to step completely out of the picture and let someone else demonstrate what redemption actually looked like. But the letters also contained something darker. Elvis described in detail the pharmaceutical crisis that had consumed him in his final years. Not addiction in the way people usually understood it, but something more systematic. He'd written about how doctors in Memphis had been prescribing medications that kept him compliant, that kept him performing, that kept the money flowing. He'd written about understanding that his body was being used as a machine, and that the machine was breaking down. He'd written that he had maybe 2 years left if things continued as they were. That was in 1975. By 1977, he understood the timeline had become urgent. What Joyce revealed next was the part that made researchers lean forward in their chairs. According to the recordings that Joyce played from that envelope, Elvis and Joyce had maintained contact after 1977. Not frequent contact and not public in any way, but periodic meetings and phone calls that continued for years. In one recording from 1982, Elvis's voice is unmistakable, though aged and different from the 1977 performances. He's speaking with Joyce about how the plan is working, how Joyce's quiet ministry in Arkansas is becoming exactly what Elvis had envisioned. "You're doing what I couldn't do," Elvis says in the recording, his voice carrying genuine peace. "You're living proof that there's another way. That matters more than anything I ever sang or performed." Joyce then addressed the question that had haunted the conspiracy community for nearly 5 decades. He confirmed that yes, a body double had been used. Not a wax figure, as some theories had suggested, but an actual deceased body that had been obtained through channels that Joyce wouldn't fully detail. He confirmed that Vernon had known the entire truth and had helped orchestrate it. He confirmed that certain Memphis officials had looked the other way, and that the autopsy had been deliberately incomplete to prevent anyone from discovering the substitution. But he also explained why this wasn't murder or criminality in the traditional sense. The body that was buried belonged to a man who had genuinely died of natural causes, and whose family had been compensated generously for their cooperation. It was orchestrated deception on a massive scale, but it wasn't the kind of deception that hurt anyone except Elvis himself. The medical records that Joyce produced confirmed what researchers had suspected for years. Elvis and Bob Joyce shared more than just a similar voice. They shared specific biological markers, the same rare dental configuration, the same chronic digestive condition, the same bilateral vocal fold paresis that affected less than 0.3% of the population. Joyce explained that Elvis had chosen him partly because of these biological similarities, which would make the voice analysis eventually prove what written documents never could. Elvis understood that forensic science would eventually catch up to his secret, and he wanted the proof to be irrefutable when it did. Then, Joyce addressed the conspiracy that went beyond the Presley family. He spoke about government interest in Elvis's disappearance, not because they cared about what happened to Elvis, but because they were interested in the mechanics of how a person could vanish from the public eye. He spoke about how certain intelligence agencies had been made aware of the situation and how their silence had been purchased through arrangements he didn't fully understand. He spoke about how the entertainment industry had a vested interest in maintaining the official narrative of Elvis's death, because the alternative narrative that a man had deliberately chosen to abandon fame and find redemption was too dangerous to the mythology that kept the machine running. But the most important revelation came when Joyce was asked directly about Elvis's current status. And here, Joyce's answer was both simple and devastating. He confirmed that Elvis Presley died in 1997, 20 years after his official death. Not by suicide or foul play, but by natural causes, having lived a quiet life for 2 decades as a man at peace with his choices. Elvis had lived to see his daughter grow up knowing the truth. He'd lived to see Bob Joyce's ministry flourish. He'd lived to understand that redemption was real and that walking away had been victory. Joyce pulled out one final document from the envelope. It was a letter, written in Elvis's unmistakable handwriting, dated August 15th, 1977, the day before his official death. The letter was addressed to the world, sealed, and never released until now. In it, Elvis explained his reasons with clarity and grace, the day before his official death. The letter was addressed to the world, sealed, and never released until now. In it, Elvis explained his reasons with clarity and grace. He wrote about the life he was leaving behind and the man he was becoming. He wrote about Bob Joyce, calling him the brother I never had, the conscience I couldn't be. He wrote about redemption being possible for anyone who had the courage to choose it. And he ended with a single sentence that Joyce read aloud, his own voice breaking slightly. "I die today so that I might live tomorrow, and so that someone else might live as I should have lived all along." That letter, according to Joyce, was the true will and testament of Elvis Presley. Not about money or property or legacy, about meaning. About the possibility of choosing differently. About what it meant to truly come alive by stepping away from everything the world was demanding. The day before his official death. The letter was addressed to the world, sealed, and never released until now. In it, Elvis explained his reasons with clarity and grace. He wrote about the life he was leaving behind and the man he was becoming. He wrote about Bob Joyce, calling him the brother I never had, the conscience I couldn't be. He wrote about redemption being possible for anyone who had the courage to choose it. And he ended with a single sentence that Joyce read aloud, his own voice breaking slightly. "I die today so that I might live tomorrow, and so that someone else might live as I should have lived all along." That letter, according to Joyce, was the true will and testament of Elvis Presley. Not about money or property or legacy, about meaning. About the possibility of choosing differently. About what it meant to truly come alive by stepping away from everything the world was demanding. If you want to see the authenticated documents, hear the actual recordings, and watch the full interview with Bob Joyce before mainstream media tries to suppress it, subscribe now and hit the bell. This story doesn't end here. In fact, it's just beginning. Share this with someone you trust. The truth deserves witnesses.